The house was silent, unnaturally silent. Not the kind of silence that lets you sleep easy. This was the kind that made your skin itch, the kind that follows you into your dream and turns them into memories you'll spend a lifetime trying to forget. 3 little girls stood frozen in a hallway. One gripped a teddy bear. The other clutched her younger sister's hand so hard it turned white. And the third, the eldest, was trying to stay strong, trying not to scream, trying not to cry, trying not to watch her mother die, because just across the living room, their father was wrapping their mother's scarf around her neck and pulling, not once, not in a moment of rage, but deliberately, slowly, with the kind of cold calculation that makes your blood turn to ice. Because she is having a divorce? That's what he told them. That's what Zafar Iqbal said, as he murdered the woman who bore his 3 lovely children. Not out of passion, not out of desperation, but out of entitlement. She asked for freedom. He gave her a funeral. And then he left. Walked out the front door, left the body, left the kids, left the country. For over 20 years he lived his life, slept in clean sheets, ate warm meals, looked himself in the mirror. While those 3 girls grew up with nightmares instead of bedtime stories, while they whispered their mother's name like a prayer, while they waited every day for the man who shattered their lives to finally face justice. And when he finally did, he smiled. This is not just the story of a murder. It's not just the story of a man. It's the story of silence, of a woman who said no, in a world that punishes women for speaking, of children who were forced to become witnesses, orphans, and warriors. It's the story of a system that took 2 long decades to say, "We believe you." And by the time it did, they had already buried their mother. They had already buried their innocence. But they never buried the truth. Because her story didn't die in that living room. Her story was just beginning. In 2001, Naziat Khan asked for a divorce. In return, she was murdered in front of her children, and her killer was protected by oceans, traditions, and silence. Until now. This is the story of Zafar Iqbal and Naziat Khan, a story of murder in the name of honor, of justice delayed but not denied, of daughters who refuse to let the world forget. Stay with me, because what happened next will leave you speechless. Naziat Khan was born in the early 1970s, in a world where daughters were both blessings and burdens. She grew up in a community stitched together by tradition, stitched so tight, there was barely room to breathe. Honor was the currency, reputation was the law, and women, they were the silent architects of the family name, expected to cook, to care, to obey, and above all else, to endure. Naziat did all 3. She was kind, warm, gentle-spoken, the kind of woman whose strength didn't shout, it whispered. And behind that whisper was a storm gathering quietly, year by year. In 1985, she was introduced to a man named Zafar Iqbal. He was over a decade older, confident, stern, traditional. The marriage was arranged quickly, sealed with blessings and expectations, but not love. For Naziat, it wasn't a union. It was a sentence. At first, there were promises. Promises of stability, of family. But promises can rot. And Zafar, he was not a husband. He was a shadow that grew darker with each passing year. The control began slowly. First, he told her what to wear. Then he told her who to see. Then he told her what to say. And eventually, he told her nothing at all. Because when you reduce someone to silence, you no longer need words to dominate them. You only need presence. And Zafar's presence was poison. Naziat bore 3 daughters, and with each birth, she smiled. Not because of her husband, but in spite of him. Her daughters were her light, her reason to keep breathing through the bruises. But even the strongest women can only breathe smoke for so long before the fire swallows them whole. The bruises were no longer just on her skin. They were in her silence, in the way she avoided mirrors, in the way she taught her daughters to lower their eyes in the presence of men, in the way she told them to keep quiet, even when it hurt, even when it burned. But something inside her changed. A flicker, a realization that if she stayed, her daughters wouldn't just grow up without a mother's joy. They'd grow up believing this was normal, that a woman's pain was a husband's right, that silence was survival. So, in 2001, Naziat Khan made the bravest choice of her life. She filed for divorce, not because she stopped loving her family, but because she started loving herself. And in a culture where divorce meant disgrace, that act of love was seen as a betrayal, a rebellion, an insult to a man's pride. For Zafar Iqbal, divorce wasn't a legal formality, it was war. And in his mind, there was only one way to end it, with silence. Naziat Khan would never live to sign those papers, but what happened in that house would echo across 2 decades, because while the world slept on her story, her daughters never did. The night it happened, the moment 3 young girls lost their mother, they watched their father become a ghost. It was April 24th, 2001, a Tuesday. A Black Tuesday for Naziat Khan and her little daughters. The kind of day that slips through memory unnoticed, unless something unspeakable happens. The sun rose like it always did, through the curtains of a suburban home in Wood Green, London. A house filled with quiet tension, the kind you don't see, but feel. Naziat Khan woke early. She always did. Her daughters stirred in their beds. The youngest, just a toddler, still babbled in fragments. The middle child followed her mother like a shadow. The eldest already learned how to read her father's moods before he opened his mouth. That morning, she read fear. Zafar Iqbal was home, sitting in silence, watching. Something was different. There was no yelling, no smashing of plates, no insults hissed beneath his breath. Just quiet. And sometimes, silence is the loudest warning. Naziat moved through her morning motions like someone walking on glass. She made breakfast, got the children dressed, tidied the house. All the while, Zafar watched. Not a word, not a smile, just eyes. Eyes that had already made a decision. Around 10:45 a.m., the eldest daughter walked into the living room. Her mother was there, kneeling, praying. A moment of peace, a moment of faith, a moment that would become her last. Zafar stood behind her. He had her scarf, and he didn't speak, didn't ask, didn't shout. He wrapped it around her neck and began to pull. The daughter screamed. She screamed for him to stop. She screamed for her mother to fight. But the sound of a child's voice means nothing to a man who believes his honor is greater than her life. Naziat struggled. Her fingers clawed at the scarf, at his hands, at the floor. Her daughters rushed toward her, tiny fists pounding at him, crying, screaming. But he didn't stop. He didn't flinch. He held the scarf until her body stopped moving, until her silence matched his. And when she finally lay still, he let go, just like that. He told his daughters why he did what he did, because she is having a divorce. That's what he said to his daughters, as if that explained anything, as if that made it okay. Then he left, picked up his keys, walked out the door, and vanished. The children were left inside, alone, with their mother's body. 3 little girls, too young to understand death, but old enough to feel its cold hand on their hearts. They sat beside her, held her hands, called her name. Maybe they thought she was asleep. Maybe they thought she'd wake up. But deep down, they knew. It wasn't until a family member arrived later that the police were called. By then, Zafar was gone. fled the country, leaving behind 3 orphans, 1 corpse, and 1 unanswered question: why? That house never felt like a home again. It became a tomb, every doorway a memory, every shadow a ghost. And for the daughters of Naziat Khan, the nightmare wasn't over. It was only just beginning. After the murder, Zafar Iqbal didn't run, not at first. He walked, calm, calculated. He left the house like a man leaving a dinner party, not a crime scene. He didn't hide, he didn't panic, because he already knew what he was going to do. Every step had been planned, every move rehearsed. Zafar Iqbal was not a man in fear. He was a man following an escape route. He boarded a flight out of the UK, passport intact, no resistance, no red flags. He flew into Pakistan like a ghost, fading from one world into another, out of the reach of British justice, and into the arms of cultural silence. He vanished into a land of untraceable villages, loyal family ties, and bribes that moved faster than warrants. Somewhere in the rural shadows of Pakistan, Zafar disappeared, and while he rebuilt a life in hiding, 3 daughters in London were left behind, alone, orphaned by domestic violence, raised by grief. The youngest couldn't remember her mother's voice. The middle child stopped speaking for weeks. The eldest blamed herself. "I was there," she once said. "I was there and I couldn't stop him." The justice system opened a case. A warrant was issued. Interpol got involved. But warrants are just paper, and paper doesn't bleed. Paper doesn't cry itself to sleep at night. Over the next 22 years, police made sporadic attempts to track him. Intelligence came in waves, rumors and whispers. He was seen at a wedding, then gone. Spotted at a mosque, then vanished. Like a shadow that knew where not to be. And in the meantime, Naziat Khan's name was forgotten by headlines. Just another domestic homicide, just another number in a cold report. But not to her daughters, not to the ones who saw, who remembered. They carried her name like a scar. One became a mother herself. Another struggled through the silence. But all of them waited for the knock, the call, the words they'd stopped believing would ever come. And then, in January 2023, after 22 years of hiding, Zafar Iqbal made a mistake. He came back, he landed in the UK, and no one knew why. Not yet. But for the first time in 2 decades, the daughters of Naziat Khan felt something new. Not grief, not despair, but hope. For 22 years, Zafar Iqbal lived as a fugitive. But on January 15th, 2023, he stepped off a plane at Heathrow Airport and straight into the arms of justice. No aliases, no disguises. Just a man who thought time would bury his heinous crime. Immigration officials noticed the red flag. The arrest warrant hadn't expired. And just like that, the man who killed his wife in front of their children was in handcuffs, quiet, calm, just like the day he strangled her. He said nothing, no resistance, no remorse. And when officers asked him to confirm his identity, he did, without hesitation, as if he knew the story was finally circling back. When the news broke, it hit like a lightning bolt across the Khan family. The daughters, now grown, froze. Imagine it. 22 years of silence shattered by a single phone call. "We've got him." Words they never thought they'd hear. The eldest daughter, now in her 30s, stood at her window that night clutching the phone, her fingers trembling, her eyes fixed on the stars, wondering if her mother was watching. The trial began in early 2024 in the Old Bailey, London's Central Court for the gravest crimes. Zafar Iqbal, now 62, sat in the dock with a blank stare. No apology, no emotion, just silence. The prosecution painted a brutal picture. They called it a premeditated murder. They spoke of control, coercion, and cruelty, of a man who refused to let his wife leave him, because in his world, divorce was a greater crime than murder. The jury heard the story from the eldest daughter. Her voice cracked, her hands shook, but her words were unstoppable. She described the way her father stood behind her mother, the way her mother gasped for air, the way he stared at them after it was done and said, "Because she is having a divorce." The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge looked down, because no sentence, no punishment could return what was lost in that room. The defense tried to play it down, claimed he was under emotional stress, that the cultural shame of divorce clouded his judgment. But the jury saw through it. They saw the monster behind the mask. On March 8, 2024, Zafar Iqbal was found guilty of murder. The sentence? Life in prison, minimum of 16 years. But for his daughters, it was never about the number. It was about the name, the one finally written into the record, Naziat Khan. They stood outside the courthouse, 3 women, once 3 little girls. They held each other. They cried. They smiled through tears, because they'd carried a ghost for 22 years. And now, the ghost had a grave. The trial was over. The man who took Naziat Khan's life was finally behind bars. Cameras flashed, headlines printed, justice served. But outside the courthouse, there were no celebrations, just silence, and 3 daughters walking away with the same ache they'd carried since childhood. Because justice doesn't fix a broken home. It doesn't hold you when the nightmares come. It doesn't stop the smell of that room from creeping back into your dreams. It doesn't turn back time. The youngest, she'd spent years asking why her mother left her, not knowing she had never left at all. She'd been taken, and no one had the courage to tell her until she turned 13. The middle child became withdrawn. She struggled with school, with trust, with the feeling that love was always just one moment away from violence. For years, she kept her bedroom door locked, even with family in the house. The eldest daughter, she became the mother. Too early, too heavy. She bathed her sisters, made their lunches, fought through her own trauma just to keep them from drowning in theirs. She grew up with a weight most children can't spell, let alone carry. And through it all, there was a picture on the mantle. A woman in a red and gold sari. Her eyes filled with light, her smile frozen in a time before control turned to cruelty, and love became a weapon. Naziat Khan, a name whispered in every prayer, a name avoided in every conversation. Because sometimes remembering her was more painful than forgetting. Healing didn't come with the verdict. It came in fragments, in therapy sessions filled with tears, in letters never sent, in journals with pages torn out, in quiet, desperate attempts to learn how to breathe again. One of them tried to visit their father, just once. She said she wanted to look him in the eye and ask, why? But when she got there, she couldn't step through the gate. She stood outside the prison wall and wept, not for him, for the little girl she used to be. But slowly they began to speak, not just to each other but to the world. In 2024, the eldest daughter spoke at a domestic violence symposium. She stood before a crowd of strangers and said, "My mother was not a statistic. She was a woman who wanted to live, and I will not let her be forgotten." They launched a foundation in Naziat's name to support other survivors of domestic violence, to tell stories, to speak names, to build a world where love never ends in silence. They're still healing, they may always be, but today they hold power, not fear. And the man who tried to silence them now lives in a world of iron and regret. Zafar Iqbal did not just murder his wife. He murdered the trust of his children. He murdered the future of a family. And he nearly murdered her story, with silence, with flight, with time. But the truth clawed its way back. And Naziat Khan will never be just a name on a missing persons list again. She is a face, a voice, a warning. Her story is not an isolated one. Every year, thousands of women across every culture, every country, are silenced by the people who claim to love them. Honor, shame, reputation. These are not just words, they are weapons, and in the wrong hands, they kill. Let's be clear, this wasn't about religion or culture. This was about control, about a man who thought he owned the woman he married, about a system that didn't protect her. What happened to Naziat Khan is not just the failure of a single man. It is the failure of an entire framework. Families who stay silent, communities that look the other way, institutions that delay justice, and laws that take decades to bring a murderer home. So what do we learn? We learn that silence is deadly, that suspicion must be spoken, that children are not too young to remember, and that justice delayed is not always justice denied. If you are in a relationship where fear lives in your home, know this: you are not alone. You are not overreacting. You are not to blame. And there is help. There is a way out. Speak. Ask. Reach out to loved ones. Because your life is yours, and no one has the right to take it. Naziat Khan's daughters fought for truth, for memory, for justice. And now we honor them by telling her story. Loudly, relentlessly, forever. If this story moved you, if you believe stories like Naziat's must be heard, then share our videos, like, comment, and subscribe to this channel. We bring you deep, investigative, true crime documentaries every single day. Real stories, real justice, and the voices that refuse to be forgotten. Hit that bell icon. Share this episode and help us shine a light in the darkest corners where monsters hide. In memory of Naziat Khan, 1981 to 2001, she deserved to live.